Fantasy football. T5 League Yearly Review.
All right, round two is upon us, and our first matchup puts Khalil Shakir from the Buffalo Bills up against Lad McConkey from the LA Chargers. Now, each of those wide receivers had very competitive first rounds. Shakir went up against Worthy from Kansas City, pulled out a nail biter in that one. And then McConkey went up against Jeudy, where both individuals ended up with the exact same fantasy totals and wide receiver ranking at the end of the year. So it was a very difficult decision when selecting the winner. But here we are today. The nice thing about this matchup is that each of these wide receivers, they've faced four common opponents in the 2024 fantasy season. That was Kansas City, Trent McDuffie and Joshua Williams; Baltimore with Pro Bowler Marlon Humphrey and Brandon Stevens; Arizona with Sean Murphy Bunting and Garrett Williams; and then New England with Christian Gonzalez and Jonathan Jones. So before we start doing the comparison in the matchup, we're going to first look at the offseason moves that each team has made just to see if there's been any changes that would potentially impact their fantasy stock going into this upcoming season. So with the Bills, good news, they extended Josh Allen, 6-year deal. Hooray. There's a very good chance that he is going to be their future quarterback that entire time. I will never expect him to leave the Buffalo Bills. He is probably going to end up in the top 3 quarterbacks in fantasy stats this year, but he does a lot of running and gets a lot of rushing touchdowns, so that doesn't necessarily translate to points for the wide receivers. Another big offseason signing was Josh Palmer on a 3-year deal. So Palmer, he's expected as of right now to be a week 1 starter along with Shakir and Coleman. So it would be Coleman on one outside, Palmer on the other, and Shakir most likely working out of the slot, which is good news for Shakir if he can get some more favorable matchups, as he's a very shifty possession type receiver that Allen relied on greatly last year. ESPN just released their fantasy projection points. So when we get into the stats, we'll look at his prior year stats and we'll compare them to this upcoming projection. And then when we look over to the Chargers and what offseason moves they've made that would impact or potentially impact Lad McConkey, they did sign guard Becton to a 2-year deal, so they're going to have some protection there within the line. They signed tight end Tyler Conklin to a 1-year deal, and they signed Najee Harris, running back, to a 1-year deal. They're also bringing back Mike Williams on a 1-year deal. So Becton, Conklin, Harris, and Williams are all expected to be week 1 starters as of right now. But the draft most likely is going to have something to say about that. And we don't know what other offseason moves we could potentially see from the Chargers as they ramp up to make a playoff push. So I took a look at a few of the mock drafts for the Chargers just to see what changes have been happening, primarily focused on rounds 1, 2, and 3. If they do get a skilled player, it's most likely going to be in those first 3 rounds, especially if that player is expected to take or have any type of fantasy implication to Lad McConkey's upcoming season. So while I was doing that research, the Chargers definitely appear ready to improve the offense in round 1 with either a tight end or a wide receiver selection. That's to be expected. Mike Williams has bounced from the Chargers to the Jets and Steelers in recent years. There's a very good chance that a high draft round pick at wide receiver is going to immediately challenge him for a starting position. Lad McConkey's pretty secure working out of that slot. I highly doubt that anybody's going to come in and get drafted that would force him out of that rotation or out of his position or impact his snap counts. And then tight end, they only signed Conklin for a 1-year deal, so there's a very good chance, depending on who's available at the time of the draft, that they do go out there and they take their shot on a first rounder. The Chargers, they're also expected to add some depth to the offensive line in the early rounds. So that could come in either round 2 or 3. I didn't see many people indicating that they're expecting them to draft offensive linemen in round 1, but we'll have to wait and see. As of right now, nothing in the offseason, nothing in the mock drafts appear to be a threat to McConkey's potential fantasy projections. And then when I was looking at the Buffalo Bills, there was some mixed opinions, especially when we were looking at like rounds 1 and rounds 3. They seem pretty locked in that they're going to be targeting a cornerback in either round 1 or round 2, but there's a chance that they slide in a wide receiver in order to help the current receiving core. Now, if they do take a shot on a wide receiver in one of those first 2 rounds, it is likely that that receiver is going to come in and immediately challenge Palmer for the starting role. And if they get one of the better college receivers. That could mean that some targets are going to be taken away. The draft is going to be very important to monitor as we continue to get closer to the next fantasy year. Let's go ahead and start jumping into the actual stats and the comparisons. So we'll make this a quick recap. We know that McConkey had a very productive season. He ended up with 241 fantasy points on the year. So he had a stat line of 82 receptions, 1,149 yards, 7 touchdowns on 112 targets. So a lot of efficiency there. In Shakir, he ended the season with 183 fantasy points, and that was on 76 receptions for only 821 yards, 4 touchdowns on 100 targets. Shakir did have 2 rushing opportunities for 4 yards, but little to none in terms of fantasy impact. Now, when I'm looking at this, a couple things that come to mind are the targets. McConkey ended up with 12 more targets than Shakir, and they're both working out of the slot. However, he did manage to get 200 plus more receiving yards on only 6 additional receptions. So that should tell us that when McConkey's playing, he's running multiple routes, short, mid, and long range, or when he's catching the ball, he's putting in those yak yards. And then when we look at Shakir, we see that most of his targets are closer to the line of scrimmage, and he can use his legs to escape. So that's going to be very important, especially depending on what kind of offensive scheme that we see Buffalo running this upcoming year. When we look into the comparisons for the similar matchups, we'll start with the Arizona Cardinals. So Ladd McConkey faced off against the Arizona Cardinals in Week 7. He had a stat line of 5 receptions for 46 yards on 7 targets. He managed 9.6 fantasy points, one of his bust weeks. So Arizona was able to shut him down. And then when we look at how Shakir fared against Arizona, he faced off against them in Week 1, where he had 3 receptions for 42 yards, 1 touchdown on 3 targets. So an extremely efficient game. He just didn't see the amount of targets that would have really driven him to the next tier when it comes to the fantasy points. He did end up with 13.2, so he gets the nod in that matchup. We'll switch to the next team, which would be against the Baltimore Ravens. Ladd McConkey faced off against the Ravens in Week 12, where he had 6 receptions for 83 yards on 6 targets. He finished with 14.3 fantasy points. Shakir faced off against Baltimore in Week 4, where he managed 4 receptions for 62 yards on 5 targets. He ended up with only 10.2 fantasy points, giving McConkey the nod over Shakir in this one. Our next team was the Kansas City Chiefs, where McConkey faced off against the Chiefs only one time this season. He was out in their Week 14 matchup. So we'll focus on Week 4, where he had 5 receptions for 67 yards, 1 touchdown on 7 targets. This was good enough for 17.7 fantasy points. And in comparison to Shakir, he faced off against Kansas City in Week 11, where he had 8 receptions for 70 yards on 12 targets, and he did manage 15 fantasy points. So in this one, that touchdown definitely played a huge factor in the fantasy points, giving McConkey the nod over Shakir. And then the last comparison is how each fared against the New England Patriots. So Ladd McConkey faced the Patriots in Week 17, where he managed 8 receptions for 94 yards, 2 touchdowns on 10 targets, and that's where he had his season-high 29.4 fantasy points. And when we look at how Shakir did, and Shakir only faced New England once, even though they're divisional opponents, because he sat Week 18 for the playoffs. He had 2 receptions for 22 yards on 6 targets, and it was one of his bust weeks with 4.2 yards. McConkey wins 3 of the battles in the head-to-head matchup comparisons to Shakir. He also had over 50 more fantasy points on the season, while only achieving 6 more receptions. One cool thing about that I mentioned earlier is that ESPN put out the fantasy projections for next year, so we'll take a quick look to see what we think. And this is really going to tell, it's like the tale of who's going to advance. So for McConkey in 2025, he's projected to have 87 receptions, which would be 5 more than last year. Only 1,069 yards, which would be almost 80-yard decrease. 6 touchdowns, so we see a -1 in that column, but he's supposed to get 126 more targets. Very interesting. So more targets, more receptions, less yards, 1 less touchdown, and that means less fantasy points. He's projected to get 227 fantasy points in comparison to the 241 he secured in his rookie season. Now, when we look at Shakir's fantasy outlook, they're expecting him to get 80 receptions, so we see a bump of 4 catches. He's expected to get 888 receiving yards, so we get a bump in that category as well. 4 touchdowns is dead even with what he did in the prior year. And then he is expected to get 7 more targets, so 107 targets this year and compared to the 100 from last year. ESPN believes he's going to have 195 total fantasy points on the season, which would be an increase from this year, but still falls well short of what we were just discussing with McConkey. Prior year statistics, upcoming year projections, offseason moves, everything is really pointing in the direction that McConkey is going to have a higher fantasy stock. He should be targeted above Shakir, and most likely he's going to be a solid WR2, a lucky flex option. All right, so we have McConkey advancing to the next round. Shakir is now officially out of our tournament. The next matchup that we're going to be covering is Terry McLaurin against Mike Evans. This one's going to be a quick battle. All right, Ladd McConkey advances. Shakir's out. McConkey makes it to round 3, where he's going to face off against the winner of our next matchup, and that is going to be Terry McLaurin going up against Mike Evans. So feel free to leave a comment, a like, appreciate the subscribes, and we'll see you in the next one.